So what I thought I would do today is share some work that we have been doing over the years, and in particular try to stress some insights that we have obtained from numerical simulations of turbulent jet flows, so jet AeroAcoustics, some insights from numerical experiments. So there is a long list of collaborators that is indicated here. In particular, I want to take the time to acknowledge the collaboration with Guillaume Brez, which has been going on for 5+ years, and Guillaume has been doing all the heavy lifting. He has been the PI on a number of sort of collaborative projects over the years, and he has created this strong team of collaborators, including experimentalists and other modelers and simulation-oriented folks. And I've also added some of my former students from whose work I'll pick a few highlights to add to the overall conversation, and my colleague Parviz mine. So how does this move forward? How do I move this forward? This is the laser pointer, or red button? Okay. Thank you. So what I would like to do is like to divide my time on these three things. First, I understand that this is a general audience. Not everyone in the group is familiar with simulations of turbulent jet flows. So I'll quickly summarize some issues that have to be considered and addressed in conducting numerical simulations of turbulent jets, which are at fidelity that is good for studying jet noise problems. And then spend about 15 minutes or so talking about some insights that have been gathered from data analysis, and then spend another 10 minutes or so on open issues, and that will bring us to summary and conclusions. It was not on? Yeah. Okay, thank you. All right. So in thinking about simulating a turbulent jet flow, we obviously need to provide the correct operating conditions, the pressure ratio and temperature ratio, which sets the flow through the nozzle, which then exhausts into a chamber into which the jet expands. So the nozzle and the operating conditions driving the nozzle flow, the exit boundary layer state, this will become an important topic for our further discussion. Entrainment that the jet entrains from the surrounding, and if there's a co-flow that is present, and other nearby objects that may be present. Installation effects may change the manner in which the jet spreads, or they may also influence the manner in which sound is radiated away from the jet and so on. So those would need to be included in thinking about installed jet situations. Of course, on the numerical modeling side, it is very important to pay attention to the spatial and temporal resolution in different regions of the jet flow. And in here, one has to pay attention to the numerical dispersion and dissipation properties of the schemes that are being used. And by choice, one would be limited to some grid which resolves up to a certain scale in the turbulent flow in various regions of the overall jet. And therefore, how one is treating motions that may be present in the real jet at high Reynolds numbers by adoption of a sub-filter scale model or a subgrid model would need to be considered. Of course, the overall simulation requires boundary conditions, and one needs boundary conditions that allow the flow to exit and quietly without creating any significant reflections. Non-reflecting boundary conditions in practice would be important. And of course, from the simulations, one would need to predict the far-field sound. So how exactly that is carried out, technical details of that are important. And overall, these simulations become large, and managing all the data and the data processing is also another issue that needs to be addressed. So these are some issues that need to be thought about. Of course, I don't want to get into each of these issues and talk about all the nitty-gritty of everything. That would not be of interest to a wide community, and we have some real experts who have worked on these problems and so on. So I'll pick only a few items and just summarize some issues that are critical to address in the list in terms of proceeding further. So the items that are underlined are the ones that I'm going to talk a little bit further about. Okay, a remarkable set of studies were published in this collaborative work of Schur, Spallart, and Strelitz. Starting from 2005, a series of 3 papers, and then further subsequent papers that have appeared that discuss these issues. And in these 2005 work, the nozzle was being emulated, and simple nozzles as well as nozzles with chevrons were being emulated through a RANS calculation, and then a turbulent flow simulation outside the nozzle in terms of the turbulent plume was being simulated in eddy resolving fashion. In this paper, 2008, we looked at all available simulations of jet noise at the time, and we discuss the various issues that I listed on the previous slide in detail. So I'm just mentioning them here so that in case there are people here in the audience who are not familiar and want to catch up on the literature, these are some review articles that you can follow to learn more about the specific things. What has happened in the community is that in the last 15 or so years, simulations have come to a point where it is possible now to take the exact nozzle geometry from a CAD specification of the nozzle to create an appropriate mesh and so on, and simulate a detailed nozzle geometry and the flow that emerges from such nozzles and mixes with the surroundings and the noise that such a jet produces. This is the state of the art today. And in approaching that, it has become important to realize that the state of the exit boundary layer, the boundary layer state at the nozzle exit, is an item that is important, and this is something that is stressed in this paper, which appeared in Journal of Fluid Mechanics recently, 2018. And so I'll discuss some highlights from this work in a short couple of slides later. And we started on this in 2015-ish. This is a paper with Guillaume as the first author, which sort of launched this whole exercise, which involves collaborations with a number of experimentalists. So one issue that I want to discuss before I want to talk about results is how do we predict the far field sound. So here is a nozzle, the turbulent jet is coming out, and the idea is that we want to deploy a numerical grid which is sufficiently fine to capture the eddying turbulent motions at various scales in the jet, but we don't want to have fine mesh further away and so on. And so we want to put a surface, a data surface or acoustic data surface or a Fox-Williams-Hawking surface which wraps this turbulent flow region, and we save data on this surface. And then as a post-processing, we pick up information that has been saved along this data surface in order to predict the far field sound. And so it's going to be based on the frequency domain version of the Fox-Williams-Hawkins equation. And there are some choices with respect to the precise detail of this equation in terms of the surface source terms that this equation has. And in this direction, a very remarkable step was made in this work by Spallart and Schur, where variations or variants of the traditional Fox-Williams-Hawking equation were described, and their accuracy or their efficacy in predicting noise from hot jets was shown. And it is this development that we evaluated further and developed some guidelines for using this approach. And so this approach uses a pressure substituted surface source term. In the surface source term, there are mass fluxes and momentum fluxes, and those involve density. And so there is a specific substitution where a density that is corresponding to the local value of pressure is, assuming isentropic variation, is what is substituted. And if it is not used in that way, then there is an extra spurious sound that comes about, and it's in order to suppress this, this becomes a useful modification. One technical difficulty with using these data surfaces is that these data surfaces, unlike the classical Kirchhoff surface, which must surround all sources of sound, it cannot be an open surface. These Fox-Williams-Hawking surfaces are of practical requirement. They must terminate somewhere, and so therefore there's some flow that passes through them, or these are so-called porous Fox-Williams-Hawking surfaces. And so in this work, a method was indicated where multiple outflow disks, so instead of having one data surface, there is a sequence of surfaces, and then through averaging of the simulation result, the post-processing, think of it this way. If I have an open surface, then a flow that is crossing that boundary has some mass and momentum flux, unsteady flux of mass and momentum at every location here. That flux of mass and momentum is not the source of sound that this jet is producing. It's the mixing that is producing the sound. And if we have this surface which is large enough so that the turbulence that is beyond where we terminate this surface is inconsequential to the sound at the frequencies that are of interest, then one could come up with this multiple outflow disk averaging procedure, which was evaluated further. And here we're showing this. These are figures from Mendez et al., published in 2013, where we show that if you use a single disk, you have a spurious sound at low frequencies, and that is reduced once you do this outflow multiple disk averaging. And of course, there are parameters in terms of how they should be spaced, how many they should be, and how does that influence the accuracy, and so on. And I'm not going to detail that. You can read about guidelines that were developed there. And this is also showing that the pressure-based Fox-Williams-Hawking surface provides a more robust prediction of low-frequency sound for hot jets, as was shown in this work. We evaluated that on our data and really looked at it, how to apply it in practice for us. Okay, let's move on. And so I want to now spend some time talking about the boundary layer, how important is the boundary layer in terms of affecting the noise that the turbulent jet makes. And so in order to do that, in these simulations, the nozzle is represented, and inside the nozzle, we are simulating the boundary layer, and we have synthetic turbulence that is produced, and a wall model is used, and I'll explain why both of these are required. The goal is that at the exit of the nozzle, we have a turbulent flow which is as realistic to the real experimental condition that would be realized. And so this, since the study was carried out in close collaboration with an experimental team, we have a detailed experimental characterization of various quantities and so on, and you will see that through this partnership, we have been able to learn a lot about what's required. And of course, everything else that I've talked about previously, we have a tightly enclosing Fox-Williams-Hawking data surface with multiple outflow disks. The numerical treatment has a way to damp things out as turbulent fluctuations leave the domain, and we provide inflow through this curved boundary in order to satisfy the entrainment needs of this spreading jet. All right, let's move on. So I've talked about the experiments. These are experiments that have been carried out at the Pre-Prime Institute at Poitiers. Peter Jordan as the lead for that team, and they have carried out very detailed measurements, hot wire, LDA, and PIV measurements, and of course near field and far field microphone measurements. And the point I want to stress is that we match not only the Reynolds number and the operating conditions, but we have the same nozzle geometry and so on in detail. The experiment has a trip which makes the boundary layer turbulent, and we are not duplicating the exact detail of the trip in terms of its precise geometry, but the rough in terms of the grid size and the location and so on. We are trying to match some overall parameters of the tripping as well. It's not too critical to match the tripping detail in these flows. It might be more important in some other flows, but I want to give you a full sense of what we carried out here. All right, and so then what we do is we have adaptive mesh refinement in various regions that I will talk about as we progress. We create synthetic turbulence. The resolution in the simulation is such that the near wall viscous scales in a turbulent boundary layer, which are very small at high Reynolds numbers, they are not going to be resolved on the mesh that we can afford to have inside this nozzle. And so we need a wall model LES approach to capture the larger scales of turbulence. So a number of variations have been carried out. I'm not going to walk you through everything and so on. I want to just impress on you that we have done our due diligence in terms of varying various parameters and so on and seeing what the effects are. In particular, contrasting cases where there's no turbulence, no synthetic turbulence, and so the exit boundary layer is laminar with 10 million mesh point resolution and 64 million in a refined case. And these cases where we have a boundary layer mesh with and without excitation in terms of synthetic turbulence and wall model, and various cross comparisons between these allow us to judge what factors are influencing what behavior in the flow that develops and so on. It's through these studies we have been able to establish the importance of getting the boundary layer turbulent with realistic properties at the nozzle exit right. So I will give you a few details of the numerical mesh that is being used. This is 10 million mesh where some regions are blown up here and cross sections at various stages are shown. And notice that these are essentially hexahedral meshes and so on, which with adaptive resolution, resolution becomes finer in regions where we expect the scales of turbulence to be small. Excuse me. So when we want to create synthetic turbulence, then we have a special boundary layer mesh which respects at least the boundary layer turbulence scales, not the viscous scales, but the outer scales are represented by having mesh which is much finer in those regions, and of course some further refinement in the near nozzle region is carried out as well. And so overall we have carried out a number of simulations where the overall number of control volumes is 16 million, and we have also carried out higher resolution simulations as well, and we'll see the results of that now. So we'll contrast the case without any turbulent forcing with here with the original mesh and with a boundary layer mesh. So just having higher resolution without any forcing allows some fluctuations to be captured. These are naturally arising. And in these plots here, we're showing pressure in the top half of the visualization and temperature in the bottom half. And I didn't specify previously that these operating conditions are isothermal jet operating conditions. So when the jet exits the temperature, the static temperature of the jet matches the temperature of the surrounding, and that's why we have the same colors on both sides. And in the mixing region here, then some turbulent fluctuations, temperature fluctuations are going to arise because of compressibility and so on. Looking at the exit boundary layer profiles, hope you can see it's a little shaded here, at least from where I see. You can see that when we have no turbulence, laminar exit boundary layer profile, that's the green profile, and it has some fluctuations because of the finer mesh that is present and so on, but the symbols here are the experimental measurements. These green curves are very far from the measurements. With a boundary layer mesh, putting finer mesh points captures the fluctuations a little better, but things are still not in good shape. They are still quite different from what the experiment is. And so now when we, with the boundary layer mesh, when we add the wall model and we add the synthetic turbulence, then as far as these profiles are concerned, we don't see much of a difference, but we really have to evaluate this more precisely. And so looking over here, we can see that the curves for the mean boundary layer profile are a lot closer to the experimental measurement. And in particular, notice that the turbulence fluctuation, U prime fluctuation RMS profile is also fairly close to what the experiment has indicated, just downstream where they could measure it. And so this is shown a little bit more detail here. The mean velocity profile, so the blue and the green correspond to the baseline LES, which did not have any turbulent forcing. And you can see that they produce this laminar profile, which is very different from the turbulent profile. As we improve the interior flow modeling with synthetic turbulent forcing and with wall model LES inside the nozzle, these curves move towards the mean profile of the experiment. And a similar thing is observed here in terms of the RMS of the streamwise fluctuations. In the experiment, fluctuations in the other directions were not measured and so on, so we could not compare V prime distribution and W prime distribution and so on. But of course, if one could measure them this close to the nozzle, that would also be further desirable. But downstream, those quantities have been measured, and we'll see comparisons with more detailed turbulence measurements. So you can see that the red curve here, 16 million control volume simulation with wall model and with synthetic turbulence is very close to the experimental U prime profile and the mean velocity profile as well. So how much difference do these treatments of turbulence make? Well, one can see a significant difference if you look at profiles along the lip line. Lip line, just in case people are not familiar. So the nozzle lip, it ends somewhere, and then just imagine going actually downstream along that axis. That's the lip line. And so we are comparing profiles along the lip line. Mean velocity, we don't see a great sensitivity in here, but we see significant sensitivity if we look at the turbulent fluctuations, streamwise fluctuating velocity RMS. When the exit boundary layer state is laminar, then it undergoes a transition process, a breakdown of the shear layer, which creates extra RMS fluctuations and so on. It overshoots the experimental measurements and so on. But when we deploy treatment of turbulence, then one has close comparison to the experimental data as well and so on, which we'll indicate next. So let's now turn attention to the acoustic predictions that are obtained from these simulations. And so details of the Fox-Williams-Hawking approach that I mentioned before are now relevant. They are applied. And so these are three different polar angles at 90 degrees to the jet and in the forward direction of the jet, 120 degrees from the inlet to the engine. So this is in the primary direction going towards 150 degrees is essentially 30 degrees from the jet axis. That's where the dominant noise radiation is. And you can see that there is some sensitivity at higher frequencies to the treatment of turbulence inside in terms of the state of the boundary layer. But as one goes towards the 90-degree away from the peak direction, there is a greater sensitivity. There is a lift up of noise at higher frequencies above Strouhal number 1, which is what when the boundary layer at the nozzle exit is laminar, it is producing. And this is very consistent with experimental measurements by Zaman, where a careful study of laminar boundary layers and turbulent boundary layers at the nozzle exit in terms of their noise measurements were carried out. And we are seeing exactly the same signature. And this has also been seen in the studies of Bourgi and Bailly as well over the years. And so with this 16 million simulation, one is providing a rather good characterization of the noise. Strouhal number range of up to about 5 is well captured with these simulations at essentially all angles, all polar angles to the jet. One can quantify this a little further, the overall sound pressure level as a function of the polar angle with different treatments of the flow inside the nozzle. The main point I want to stress is that this is the difference between having a laminar boundary layer at the nozzle exit and a more realistic turbulent boundary layer exiting the flow. And the difference is different at different orientation, different polar angles. It's at 90 degrees that there is a large difference, and of course the spectral distribution of this difference we saw previously. All right, so move on. We've made comparisons to PIV measurements. These are the mean flow and the fluctuation U prime measurements. These two figures on top, and this is our baseline simulation, 16 million control volume with wall model and with turbulence, and a refined simulation also using the same treatment of turbulence now with 69 million, and you can barely see any difference between these. There are some small differences. The differences that you see here are due to lack of full statistical convergence of this finer resolution simulation, which needs to be run longer in order to converge but there are no significant noticeable differences between this baseline simulation and the refined simulation, and they are in very good agreement. And the agreement is not just in terms of this color norm that this picture shows, but if we quantitatively compare profiles and so on, those agreements are also very good and so on, and I'm not going to belabor that comparison further. So having achieved it, this is one last comparison in terms of acoustic predictions at different angles, the dominant direction of jet noise going towards 90 degrees with the original simulation, baseline simulation, and a refined simulation. And the main take-home message I want to communicate to you is that as we refine, we capture a larger range of Strouhal numbers more accurately, progressively. But overall, with 16 million control volumes, one is able to do a very good job of capturing the overall jet flow and the sound that is produced by this jet. So with this data, then we want to launch into the exercise of analyzing it and see what we can learn, what insights we can gain. And so I'll spend some time describing a summary of some of these insights from the subsonic Mach 0.9 jet, and will give some highlights from other simulations that have been carried out for supersonic conditions and so on. So the jet simulations that I showed, we can subtract the mean from that LES calculation from an instantaneous realization. This figure is taken from this very nice detailed paper by Oliver Schmidt et al., published last year in JFM. And the color coding or the grayscale coding is that black, dark gray is a positive velocity fluctuation, and the white is negative velocity fluctuation. And so if you just sort of stare at this, wink at it, you will see that there is organization in this turbulent flow. This is one realization, but you can see that there is large-scale organization. There are larger patches of higher velocity next to a fairly large patch of lower velocity, and the scale of these patches is becoming smaller as you go towards the nozzle and so on. And add a few cross sections. This is x over d of 2 and 5, and at different stations, azimuthal instantaneous cut at the same particular time. And so if you have images of this kind from PIV measurements and so on, you can put them next to each other and convince yourself that the simulation is doing the right thing. Of course, the purpose of indicating instantaneous global view of the turbulent flow is to draw your attention to the fact that there is a large-scale organization, there is a coherence in this flow, and in order to bring that coherence out, it is important to take full advantage of certain symmetries that the overall flow has. It's stationary in time, and so we're going to do a frequency domain analysis, and we're going to do it's homogeneous with respect to orientation or the azimuth angle, and so we're going to do a polar decomposition and azimuthal decomposition. And so I'm going to show a few snapshots of results from this very detailed paper. This is the azimuthal mode index equal to 0, meaning axisymmetric mode. So we have the instantaneous fluctuation data. We do its Fourier transform. We take its Fourier series in terms of azimuth variations, e to the I m theta. This is m equal to 0. And then we also take Fourier transform in frequency, and this is the particular Struhal number of 0.5. And then these are two different FFT realizations of short time records, indicating what you can see in those shorter time series. And based on these realizations, one can build an estimate for the cross-spectral density associated with fluctuations. So here on the left is the cross-spectral density for pressure, and on the right is the same quantities, but for the streamwise velocity fluctuation. And so cross-spectral density is the correlation between the quantities at two different points. So this blue plus sign, hopefully you can see, that is the reference location, and then this is plotted as a field. The cross-spectral density is a function of the radial position and the streamwise position. Both are inhomogeneous coordinates. The homogeneous coordinates have been removed by the frequency decomposition and by this azimuth modal decomposition and so on. And so once that's done, the cross-spectral density is still a function of 4 independent variables. So it's kind of hard to visualize this 4-dimensional field, but a good way to sort of picture it is that we fix the reference location, and then we have a 2-dimensional field. And so this is one reference location, and this is another reference location corresponding to a point next to the nozzle exit, and this is the cross-spectral density. So cross-spectral density is a function of both the azimuthal index and Struhal number. And this data can then be compressed, or one could say, what is the information that this data has? And one could do a POD decomposition of this cross-spectral density. So this is the so-called spectral POD, because this is based on the spectral cross-spectral density. And the POD mode for pressure very nicely shows this organization in the flow at Struhal number of 0.5, where there's this alternating variation of high and low and high and low and so on. And one could say, are these instability waves? And of course, they are related to instability waves. And we have carried out a detailed analysis of the mean flow that this turbulent flow produces and carrying out a local stability analysis based on those mean flows and so on. And that gives rise to modes that look like this. But saying that it is an instability wave is not enough in terms of being able to predict this flow and so on. So that's the point that I would like to speak to further. But let me highlight this a little bit more. Here, we like to call them wave packets. These are wave packets that have been deduced for pressure at m equal to 0, this azimuth index, which is actually symmetric, and m equals 4 side by side. And this is increasing Struhal number. So as Struhal number increases, the scale associated with this wave packet, the oscillation scale shrinks, and so on. And these are very consistent with measurements that have been reported in previous analysis of instability wave behavior and so on that has been characterized and so on. And here is being done using a fully realistic turbulent flow simulation corresponding to a turbulent boundary layer exit with all the right properties and so on. Okay, so moving on. One can quantify this comparison now. And so previous studies, starting at least as far back as Jouvet, perhaps earlier, Kopiev and others, Cavalieri, have shown that only a few azimuthal modes are necessary in order to represent the sound pressure level as a function of polar angle and so on. The red here corresponds to the axisymmetric mode and so on, and this is the total. And so we're going to carry this out for this jet. And the experimental analysis was done by the experimental team at Poitiers, P Prime Institute, and we are duplicating exactly the same analysis, same procedures followed in terms of data analysis for the experiment as well as for the simulation. And so the data for these azimuthal arrays is gathered on a set of microphones, which is at 14.3 diameter radius of the jet. And so I'll show you a few comparisons here. The symbols here, which come as dark lines here, they are the experimental measurements, and then the color lines that you will see are from the simulations. And the point I want to make is that it is not just the overall power spectral density, but its decomposition into azimuthal modes, axisymmetric mode, helical mode, and m equals 2 mode, and so on. The detailed distribution for different angles is also duplicated rather precisely between the simulation and the experiment. And so this numerical experiment is a faithful rendition of the real lab experiment, or it's very close to the real lab experiment as well. That's the main point I want to make. This is now going in the direction of the peak radiation and so on. The first axisymmetric mode contains a large part of the power spectral density as a function of Struwell number. As you go to higher Struwell numbers, you need these higher modes in order to come up to the overall power spectral density. All right, so enough of that. Here one can show a distribution in terms of the azimuth variation with respect to azimuth index as a function of polar angle. And the message I want to communicate to you is that simulations are capturing a lot of very detailed behavior that has been systematically observed in the experiments. And so it's possible to go a little further and ask what is happening, what may be producing the sound, how can one try to understand that. And so now we have a large database running to about 2,000 acoustic time units. And so we segment the data and into different blocks, and then we can come up with estimates of all the quantities over these segments and then compare them, and thereby we can try to understand whether there is intermittent behavior occurring in this flow or not. And so these are at 90 degrees from the jet and towards the primary intense direction of noise radiation. These are the individual points here correspond to individual estimates corresponding to individual blocks. And so there's scatter, and the mean is plotted there compared to experiment. And so we can quantify this a little bit more. Given that scatter, we can calculate a probability distribution of getting certain decibel values. And so what this is showing is that at least in this 90-degree polar angle, this distribution, one could say, is relatively narrow with respect to the sound intensity. It's a Gaussian-like distribution, and so one could say that for 90-degree emission, there is no significant intermittency that is supported by the data. But let's ask what happens when you go in the primary direction of jet noise. Now, over a range of Strouhal numbers, we see a wider distribution of the intensity of radiation, and therefore, it's supporting that there is intermittency in the noise emission in the primary direction of jet noise. And this supports the hypothesis which has been made previously, where wave packets were found to underpredict the far-field sound by by almost 20 dB, and it was claimed that it must be intermittency or jitter of these wave packets which is giving rise to the intense emission and not the wave packets themselves, and so on. So the point I want to stress is that there is this further detail of the dynamics. Just saying that it is instability waves is not enough to explain the sound radiation, because if you take the picture of instability waves and compute the wave packet on that basis, the sound emission associated with the extended wave packet that will have a contribution in the sonic range of wave numbers is going to fall short of the measured sound by a large amount, by as much as 20 dB or so. So it's not a small departure, and you require this intermittency or jitter in the wave packets in order to explain the overall sound that is observed. Okay, so let's now step a little more quickly from subsonic. Let's go supersonic. So this will go a little faster. No pun intended. So simulations at other conditions have been done, and these were reported by Guillaume in 2017 AIAA journal paper. And these were results that were carried out for experiments conducted at UTRC. We were told the operating conditions, but the comparison was blind. We made the acoustic predictions. We handed the data to UTRC. They made the plots. And then we got to see how the predictions compared to the measurements. And this is, I think, a good exercise in the community to actually conduct exercises of this kind. More exercises of this kind need to be conducted by a team that vets both the experimental measurements and the simulation results and so on. So more of this is required in the community. But what I want to stress is that we are capturing the mixing noise for isothermal supersonic jets, for hot ideally expanded jets, as well as pressure mismatched, in this case hot overexpanded jet, and the broadband shock associated noise as well, and so on. And more studies of this have been done and so on, but I'm not going to belabor this point. This is something that has been studied by a number of other groups, in particular by Schur, Strelitz, and Spallart very extensively, including effect of flight on the shock cell noise as well. So a few eye candy pictures of a few other configurations that have been looked at. And so I want to now talk about some further insights that have been gained from analysis of data from simulations. And so there is this term that Sean Fox-Williams used to describe what he called, this is almost the title of his paper in 1975 in JFM, the most annoying component of supersonic jet noise, crackle. So what is crackle? Well, crackle is this annoying sound from hot supersonic jets that is heard almost like a clap or like a sonic boom in a sense. Its mechanism has been unknown, and there's been speculation that whether it is source nonlinearity or whether it's intense acoustic waves that steepen and form shock, and that's what is creating that signature. So in the simulation now it's possible to explore that, and so of course we go through a detailed comparison. We get signatures. These horizontal lines correspond to RMS. So we get large excursion, these intermittent events where there is intermittent N-wave emission that is being heard by an observer. So then the question, and of course this is the criteria of Fox-Williams, that it's a skewness of the pressure fluctuation, and when it's above 0.4, he experimentally called it crackle. So by his criteria, we are seeing crackle. And what is it? We can go inside, oops. We can go inside the flow, and we find that these events, if we correlate them back, we find that they are, in fact, being emitted as shocklets. These are intense pressure waves that are already shock waves as they are being emitted, and that is what Crackle is. And so this is an insight that has come from simulations. Let me rapidly move through this. Jet screech is a phenomena that is of importance due to its damaging aspects for nozzle and nearby airframe components. It was discovered in the 1950s, and a theory for frequency of screech has been well established, and it involves this feedback loop, growing instability waves interacting with the shock cell structure, creating an upstream traveling sound which interacts with the nozzle lip and closes the loop, creating this instability wave and so on in the cycle. When you look at the phasing of time delay in the cycle, one comes up with a screech prediction formula, which has been very successful. Lately, in the last few years, an additional contributor to this feedback path in terms of upstream traveling instability waves has been implicated, and this is very exciting. However, what is missing is there is no theory for predicting amplitude. Here is a summary from Raman's measurement in 1997 from Journal of Fluid Mechanics. This is the frequency as a function of the jet Mach number, and this can be predicted very well. But amplitude, it turns on rapidly, doesn't vary a whole lot, and then switches off. That is missing, and so there is a model that is a numerical problem, which I should have timed myself better. Shocks inside, when shear layers are significantly organized, are able to leak across. It's unclear at this point whether this is really operative in a turbulent jet situation or not. So that's an open issue requiring further investigation. I want to wrap up by mentioning that there are other open issues. This is a long-standing issue and so on. But I want to just very briefly mention that if you collect data from experiments and plot overall sound pressure level as a function of Mach number, acoustic Mach number, this is the actual Mach number in the square brackets here, for different temperatures, heated supersonic jets, there is a whole bunch of data here which seems like a mishmash, scatter, and so on. This blue line is sort of the Vj to the 3 slope suggested by Fox-Williams back in the 1960s. We can analyze this a little further, and if we scale out the density from it, the scatter just for supersonic only data is significantly reduced, and this is the power law that one finds. I want to stress that only a limited range of acoustic Mach number and jet heating is available in terms of experimental data, so it's still an open question. What is the scaling law for intermediate range and ultimately over a larger range as the acoustic Mach number continues to rise? What is ultimately the behavior of this, which may be important from rocket launch applications, so not for aviation. And so that's still an open issue. And there has been interpretation of jet noise in terms of two components of jet noise. I think there are mysteries in there that are yet to be sorted out, and a more complete theory of jet noise is still missing. And so let me just put up these conclusions that it's now possible, it's been possible to do a very detailed simulation ensuring turbulent exit boundary layers and so on, very detailed comparisons which provide good comparison to experiments when we pay attention to important details. And then those analyses of data have led to important insights that I shared with you. There are still, jet noise is an old problem. Lighthill's original work, which in a sense launched the field of AeroAcoustics in 1952, was 66 years ago or so. We still have open problems, and I think the exciting thing is that we have come to a stage where combined numerical simulations and experiments can combine the benefits of each method to provide new insights. And simulations have lots of uses. One can develop low-order modeling and so on, statistical representation of sources, other wave packet type models and so on. And of course, one can use them, and this has been shown in the Schur, Spalart, Strelitz work, how these simulations can already be used to think about optimization of nozzle shapes and so on. But what I want to stress, I was inspired by the title of the conference, Numerical Experiments in AeroAcoustics, that we should use simulations not only to predict detailed things of a particular realization, but we should do what-if simulations, where in simulation we can change things in order to figure out what their impact is, a test of modeling assumptions, a test of simplification of the physical flow that you are creating, idealized problems and so on. And we don't see enough of it, and I want to stress that it is tremendously useful to gain some insight and improve the understanding, improve the science of our subject. Technology, of course, is being pushed and improved, but I think it's important to also advance the science that is behind these developments for the longer run. So thank you all very much for your patience. And